As you're coming in and getting settled, if you don't mind in the chat sharing which church you're from, that would be great information for us to have as folks who are putting these workshops together, just so we can know who's represented and who's here. There are so many of you tonight, 19 of you signed up, that we are not probably going to have time for everybody to go around and introduce themselves. So feel free to put your church and a little information about yourself in the chat. That would be a wonderful way for us to connect. I believe completely that we churches can share things with each other outside of these kinds of things too. And so you may find a neighboring church that you can connect with and do some personnel related stuff together. We are also recording tonight so that anyone who is not able to be here tonight can watch this later and learn as well. Okay, great to see all this coming in. Terrific. All right. Well, we're missing a few folks, but we're going to go ahead and get started, and folks will come in as they can. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kimberly Sechrist Ashby. I am the interim pastor at Mount Hebron Presbyterian, and I serve on the Commission on Ministry, which is co-sponsoring this workshop with the Commission on Spiritual Leader Development. We are trying to meet the needs that we're hearing from our churches for education and continuing assistance in things that are really and crucially important to our churches, especially right now. So on behalf of both of the commissions, welcome and thank you very much for your interest tonight. We are focusing tonight on personnel committees, why it's important to have them, even if it's part of your session work. For smaller churches, larger churches, it's a little bit easier. And we're also talking about some best practices, how to operate personnel committees well. And so you all should have received earlier from me today some information and a link to the Presbytery website that has more. And all of our presenters will be referring to different things tonight within that. I want to introduce our presenters tonight. Reverend Todd Smith is the pastor at Bethel Presbyterian, and Reverend Andrew Connors is the pastor at Brown Memorial Park Avenue, and Reverend Terry Martin Minnick is the pastor out at Hancock Presbyterian. They all have some good experience with this, and they have served in various roles through the presbytery and are excited to share with you tonight. Our format will be that we are going to give each of them some time to present different aspects about personnel committees. And then once they are done presenting, then we will take your questions and have a discussion. And then before we finish tonight, I want to ask about future events you might like to see, ideas you have for topics and themes that you think would be helpful for your church and for the presbytery. So with that, let's open with a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we are so grateful for your spirit among us tonight, for the wonderful participation we have tonight in this workshop, and for the care that we each have about the staff of our churches, our pastors, our lay staff who work so hard to make this a glimpse of the kingdom of God, the way that we can bring and share your love to the world today. We ask tonight that you guide our discussion, that you grant wisdom and discernment, that you help us to connect and find new ideas and new ways to lift up your people and to support those who are doing such vital work in our midst. We ask that your Spirit's presence be with us in all ways tonight, for we pray in your Son, our Savior's mighty name. Amen. All right, to begin tonight, I'm going to turn it over to Terry, who will get us started with some theology. Terry.
That sounds kind of daunting, that we would start with theology. But I think one of the challenges we have in the church, no matter when or why or how we are meeting, is to remember why we are here, what makes us different. Back in the 90s, I started working on my doctorate at McCormick, and a lot of pastors did at that point. And one of the things that we were looking at was the church as a complex organization. And we were hit with a course on complex organization theory. And it didn't take long for us to realize that, yes, the church is a complex organization, but it is not a business. And I think it's really important for us as pastors and elders to remember that we are not a business. It's a difference. There are people who work with ethics for businesses, but we are the Church of Jesus Christ, and how we approach all of our committees, all of our work, whether it be in-house or mission outreach, it is through the body of Christ. And because we are not a business, it's really important that the church be grounded in the faith, in the Gospels, in our belief systems, in the community of faith. I think it's really important to remember that. I'm reminded of the story of the difference between justice and mercy. And sometimes when we work on personnel committees, we need to remember the difference between justice and mercy. And a society matron was having her photograph taken for a newspaper article. And the photographer came to her home and he took photographs and poses and such. And because it was digital, she could see the poses on the proofs right there. And so she would look at a proof and she would look in a mirror. She would look at a proof and she would look in her mirror. And finally she said, "Sir, these photographs do not do me justice." And he replied, "Ma'am, you don't need justice, you need mercy." And that's where I think that's the difference between being a complex organization and business and being the church. We need to know when we need to show not only justice, but justice channeled with mercy, and how we go about our work. There are two, I think, very fine documents that the denomination has put out. One is going to be referred to in our presbytery materials, but the employment guidelines for PCUSA sessions and session personnel committees, I think that's referenced in our notes tonight. It's 2021 through the Office of the General Assembly. And I really recommend that you take a look at it because it includes a really good way of, and it's 35 pages, but I'm of the age where I print things out, and it's not that awful that you can still print it out on both sides of the piece of paper, good stewardship, but it also has some very, very fine ways of talking with us as we do personnel committee and committee work. But one of the first things, the theological underpinnings, is that from our own Book of Order, it says, "In our own time, we affirm that in the power of the Spirit, the church is faithful to the mission of Christ as it proclaims and hears the word of God, administers and receives the sacraments, nurtures a covenant community of disciples of Christ." And then there is, of course, the section on the great ends of the church. And I highly recommend that you take a look at this and say to your committee, hey, we are not here just to make sure this person does this, this, and this, but how do we assess how this person does this? How do we hire the person with the gifts? How do we discern those gifts? How do we look at the person's gifts that are unique to that? Every person's gifts are unique to them. And how do we make the most of the gifts that they bring to us? I once had a secretary who was she had much more gifts in one area than she did in another, but she was so good at what she did and brought such incredible gifts that we worked it out with her job description that she would be able to function very well. And that may not be the right secretary for another position or another church, but it worked with us. And I think that's really important for us to look at. And to remember that we have to practice the gospel in what we do. We have to treat others as we want to be treated. we have to do the simple things that aren't so simple, and they're challenging. And sometimes they're downright hard when we have to hold someone accountable. But how do we do that with mercy and tempered justice? That's my introduction. That was 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Terry. We are moving on now to Todd, and I have a slide to share for him.
All right. I kind of get the philosophical side of things tonight, and what I've heard over and over again, having been on Committee on Ministries, having served on personnel teams, things I've heard from churches. Well, we're such a small church. We can really handle this in-house, or we only have one staff member or two, or we're just kind of informal. Well, I think what we learned coming out of COVID is when stress hits a system, we need things to fall back on. So why a personnel committee? A personnel committee, first of all, provides the paper trail. It provides a way for you to be able to objectively work with your personnel. Number one, you provide an orderly, focused, considerate way to create a healthy work environment. It's extremely important that your people, pastor, secretaries, Christian ed staff, whatever, are in an organization in which there is organization and there is a place and a time for everyone. Number two, to develop staff policies, procedures, and practices. I can't emphasize how important it is to have good policies and procedures so that your staff knows what the expectations are. Your personnel committee knows what the expectations are, and those expectations are something that can be shared with the congregation. They can come and look at the policies and procedures manual and know how, why, and where we work in according to our relationship with staff. Three, and this goes right along with the theological, we need to be able to provide counsel and support for the staff. These are people, and they're usually people of faith. They're people that come with real issues, real celebrations, real joys, real crises, real triumphs. They come into the church, and it's very important that in regards to our staff, that the church be the church. And if you have good, sound, structured practice within your personnel policies, you can make sure that your staff feels supported. I think one of the things that we realized during COVID is that we had a mass exodus of staff. And partly it was because we didn't pay as close of attention to the need for a positive, strong personnel committee. 4, provide support for the head of staff in managing staff relations as needed. Your pastors need help. They aren't all administrators. Quite often we aren't administrators. Something we learn on the job. There isn't too much in seminary. Some that teach that work with us in these things, but the head of staff needs support. The head of staff needs your attention. The head of staff needs to be able to go to a personnel committee and say, I'm really having issues. Can you help me hash this out? Or the head of staff needs to be able to go to policies and procedures manual and go to the personnel committee and say, maybe we need to reevaluate and look at A, B, C, and D in regards to employee A, B, or C. So the head of staff needs to be supported by the personnel committee. And finally, most importantly, I don't know how many times I've heard this in 30 years. Well, I'd really like to know how you got to that number for this person's salary this year. Where did you just pick it out of the air? I really don't agree with that raise. Tell me why. When you have good policies and procedures, you establish compensation, somebody comes to you with that question, you can take the anxiety and immediately tamp it down by saying, I'm glad that you've asked. Here's the formula that we used. So these are all not by far not comprehensive, but as I was going through all the stuff I had from over the years, these are the 5 that stood out to me the most. Just as practical reasons why you need a personnel committee. Because we're not a business and we're not full of business people. So we do need to have some of the HR from the world from the outside world mixed with our theological, so that we can have a good, cohesive, strong personnel policy. It takes the pressure off the session. It takes the pressure off the personnel team, takes the pressure off the pastor. So I think that's 5 minutes. Yep.
Terrific. Thank you, Todd. I'll turn it over to Andrew, who's got a couple of sections.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. I'll try to be as concise as my colleagues on this. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about roles and responsibilities of the personnel committee, the pastor and/or pastors, and the session. And then I'll talk a little bit about an overview of a personnel manual. We've already heard one very up-to-date resource. I'm going to direct us to one that is a little bit older, but that I really like in terms of the way it's organized. This is also on the Presbytery website. It's an older version of this guidelines for session personnel committees. It looks older, but you can find it there. I was thinking about dropping the link, but then I decided, no, you should really go to the Presbytery website. I think the link is on the Committee on Ministries section, perhaps. Is that right? Or is it the resources for congregations? We can clarify that before the end.
It's probably both, Andrew, but I know it's the resources for congregations page for sure.
Okay, great. But I'm going to skip ahead to page 4. I will warn you, we talked about this in our prep session for this. There are 40 pages to this document. And we know that some people see 40 pages, or Terry said earlier, 37 pages, and they say, I'm not reading that. So we're really trying to direct you about the important content that is in some of these documents. You should just, nibble on it a little bit at a time. But this is on page 4. And as we think about roles, obviously a personnel committee is going to be different depending on the size of the congregation. But I thought this was very key. In churches where there is a head of staff, it is important that the session personnel committee not interfere with the ongoing supervision that the head of staff provides. In such situations, the personnel committee works in a supportive and counseling relationship with the head of staff and with other staff as needed. So I think as you think about roles and responsibilities, that's an important one to define from the very beginning of the establishment of a personnel committee. There's a reason you have a head of staff. And as these documents suggest, the committee should be in a supportive role as it relates to those other staff members. And I think Todd raised a really important point, concrete example about compensation. Compensation is a tangible way that people often rally around a particular staff member without thinking of the whole. A head of staff, a personnel committee should be thinking about the whole. I'm zipping ahead here. You can form a session committee simply by suggesting it as an elder. 3 to 5 members is the standard. That's been my experience at Brown Memorial. It's worked quite well. They can be members of the session or others from the congregation, although a session member will serve as the chair. And the pastor is an ex officio member, though on occasion it is advisable for the committee to meet without the pastor. That's also been my experience. As in when they're reviewing my annual evaluation, it's much more helpful for them to get together, sort through information that they've received, and figure out which pieces are emerging themes and so forth. I think this is key. I wish I had more time to emphasize this. All members should be able to keep confidences and be supportive of people in the church. This goes back to what Terry was saying about the theological underpinnings. They should be open-minded, fair-handed, reasonable, and well-balanced. Persons with axes to grind should not be part of the committee. Now, I know all of our congregations are perfect. We don't have people with axes to grind. But actually, if you want to chase away your staff, the quickest way to do that is to put someone with an axe to grind on the personnel committee. So I think the selection of people, the appointment of people to personnel committee is critical. This is not a committee where anyone who raises their hand to volunteer should be allowed to serve. This is a session committee, and the session should designate who those folks are and should think very carefully about exactly the types of folks that have been named here in this document. I'm skipping ahead now to the overview of a personnel manual. I think we've already heard about some of the committee responsibilities, but they're here in this documents for you. There's a nice warning about not getting caught up in controversy, but I think that goes again to keeping the missional focus on the reason for the committee and making sure that the people who are appointed to that committee are fair, reasonable, and open to the truth. Here we get into the beginnings of a personnel manual. I think that as it states here, it is essential that all congregations have manuals. And that is simply because you want to have guidelines about things like normative practices, vacations, time off, well before specific questions come into focus.
Mhm.
This is also the concrete tool for ensuring fairness and equity across your system. Otherwise, again, there's going to be favoritism and those sorts of things that are allowed to creep in. There are obviously legal reasons to have a personnel manual. And I'll tell you, one of the best pieces of advice that I received from an elder who is also an attorney is be careful when you put things in writing around policies, because then you're obligated to follow them.
Mhm.
So it is not the case that you need to always put every single issue that may or may not emerge in a personnel policies manual. You need to rather think about the critical issues for establishing fairness, complying with the law, and so forth. And this is then a summary of different things that you would have in your personnel manual. You have 2 more minutes. We can look over them quickly. And the last thing I'll say about this manual is, I don't know if you all have had this experience, but I would say in the last 10 years, the Board of Pensions of the Presbyterian Church, which is the benefits arm of our church, has experienced more change probably in the last 5 years than in the last 60. That has created a lot of work for personnel committees if you've served on one, or if you have just been responsible for thinking about things like retirement plans and so forth for your staff. The personnel committee has been essential in sorting through those new offerings by the Board of Pensions with an eye toward fairness. And in my own congregation that has, significant staff, it's not a huge staff, but significant, we've had to really work through some challenges related to long-term staff who have had the what I refer to as the Cadillac version of the Board of Pensions offerings. It used to be the only offering, now shifting to a menu of offerings. The personnel committee is the place where all those sorts of things are sorted out. So I think I'm at my 10 minutes. I'm going to hand it back over.
Thank you, Andrew. And we are headed back to Terry for job descriptions.
I think the important thing about writing a job description is writing it in such a way that you can assess what it is that you have made or you are able to evaluate that process or that person's specific jobs. Job descriptions need to be clear and specific, and it helps to understand how much time you put in. There are some pastors that spend hours and hours on sermon prep and worship preparation. That has to be taken into consideration. And there are congregations that would want pastors to do special visiting. But I think one of the things that we have to take in consideration is the different churches and the different size churches we are. Andrew's church has a staff, and I am the staff at Hancock Church. I'm the secretary and the pastor, which I'm not sure how that goes together, but that's part of my job description. I do the bulletin and correspondence. Excuse me. But the important thing is that my congregation knows that I do that. And that's we're a small church. We can't afford a big budget. The good news is I don't have to be the housekeeper, which would make it even worse. But this is all good. But job descriptions also do not remain the same every year, because our churches are changing, our churches are growing. Been through a pandemic. We're still going through it. Our church, the way we do ministry in the church has changed. And it's challenging, as Andrew said, the changes that have been made by our General Assembly in the last 5 years are incredibly different than those that were here. The changes in the Book of Order when we started out many, many years ago. So that keeping in mind the size of the church and what it is that you want your pastor or your person, whether it's the pastor or the organist or the choir director or the housekeeper, what it is you want them to do. And I think, again, getting back to the theological underpinnings, sometimes the first person that anyone connects with in your congregation is your church secretary, because they answer the phone. And having someone answer the phone who really likes what he or she does makes a difference than having someone answer the phone who's just putting in the time. And you're smiling. I can see some of you are smiling, but that makes a difference. And so what kind of and how do you put that in a job description, that you're happy with what you do? And that you see this as your vocation, as your calling, just as the pastor's called, so are the other staff members. The other part of that is the sexton, or the housekeeper. That person knows much more about what's going on in the church, with what needs to be done, and it is seen by a lot of folks. And again, keeping the people happy in one way is being generous and kind in how we assess and evaluate their performances on an annual basis. So that goes from everyone, from the pastor to the secretary, to the musicians, I've got two Scotties, to the musicians, to the sextons. So I think that's really what I wanted to say. And how we write this, responsibilities, are we going to ask for an outstanding biblically based preaching and teaching ministry that'll attract people? Well, how do you assess that? How do you evaluate that? I have some Sunday mornings where 2 or 3 people will say, "Good sermon, Pastor," and everybody else just walks out and shakes my hand. So, I mean, I don't know, but I think it's important to say, okay, maybe this means to ask people to evaluate and not be afraid to say, okay, the personnel committee is going to ask people to say, are we hitting the mark, or are we missing the mark, or where are we going with this? Those are to be as practical and kind as possible is what I see. It's very hard to assess inspiring the session and the congregation to develop, but I think we can assess our leadership. Is the person who is your pastor leading with love? And again, it's back to the theological underpinnings. I used to say that we get paid an incredible salary for being a pastor because my job is to love people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's incredible. What a job, what a vocation we have. And if you have a pastor or person working there who doesn't want to be there, then you need to find that out. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. And it's because every job description, you really have to wrestle with and really find what are the things that you want to have accomplished. And whether it is building up the youth group, the youth program, and what kind of staff you need to do that, or how to shift the staff, or working on outreach, or working on Bible study, or working on outreach. It has to be, you know what you want from your church.
Thank you, Terry, very much. All right, we'll go back to Todd, and I'll put those slides back up again for you, Todd.
So, annual reviews and discipline. Everybody, almost everybody gets to, and almost, you know, everybody's had an experience with an annual review where you've gone in with your knees shaking, and that shouldn't have to be the case. You know, annual reviews can be incredibly useful tools to increase staff morale, to help the church. They need to not be something to fear. And the most important distinction, I'm glad we put these together, is there's difference between performance evaluation, setting goals for somebody that might be falling short of the mark, setting expectations of accountability. That all goes under annual review. That is not discipline. I think one of the most important things you need to realize is underperformance in staff is not something that you discipline somebody for. And if you have a good review process, a good job description, you know, a well-structured, concise annual review process, then you will not mix the difference between discipline and performance evaluation. So why is the annual review important? What should it do? It should speak specifically to the tasks defined and agreed upon with the employee. Job description, review old goals, and set new goals. That's one of them. That's the most important part of the annual review, to establish that this is what we're here for. And that's why I think what Andrew said, making sure that there's nobody on that committee that has an axe to grind, you know, is there. And another important aspect of that is if over the years somebody on the committee has developed a difficult relationship with somebody on the staff, you ask them to recuse themselves from participating in that person's annual review. The annual review should be a place where you could specifically and concisely work with that employee, their job description, reviewing goals and setting new goals. That annual review should help people grow and find satisfaction in their work. If you want to keep staff, and we all want to keep staff, and we've all lost staff. I lost some staff in COVID. You know, it was due to economic reasons, but there were a number of churches that lost staff because that staff didn't have that satisfaction. We kind of imploded. And so an annual review process should be geared towards lifting people up. And if there are shortcomings, if there are things that need to be worked on, it should be geared towards helping that person. And it's also the place where you can decide that maybe this isn't going to work, but you can do it in a grace-filled way. So that's an important part of the review process. It should identify areas that are obsolete or need embellishing. I think Terry already referred to that. You know, you need to, what does this position need? Maybe we thought this position was important, but over the past year, it's become more important that the first voice on the phone be one that's welcoming and kind and loving. And maybe those 3 or 4 mistakes in the bulletin every week don't matter as much, you know, is that. So it should help to identify things you need to throw out of that job description and things that might need embellishing. And that needs to be a dual conversation between the staff person and the annual review and the people doing the annual review. It should identify problem areas with regards to other staff and church members. This is where that comes up. And not just in the annual review, but if something goes wrong, if there's a relationship crisis, you know, whatever, it goes to the personnel committee. But the annual review is a place to have an open conversation about those things. If a staff member is having problems with the pastor and they haven't resolved it, then that person goes to the personnel committee. I mean, having that annual review process is a place where all of these things, the groundwork for these things can be laid. And I could go on over and over about this, but I won't. I'll go to the next one. Now, discipline is completely different from setting accountability expectations like I talked about before. Elements of a stated disciplinary process, and a lot of this stuff comes right from the denomination. It really does. It should be made clear that ordained staff members are subject to the presbytery discipline process of the Book of Order. So if there is a problem with, a violation of ethics or whatever with the pastor, that goes to COM. That goes to COM. And an administration committee or personnel committee should refer disciplinary actions that might need to be, those should be reported to COM and let the presbytery process take over. Now, it can be the same for elders and other church members, but really this disciplinary process for the ordained staff member should go through the Book of Order process. Criteria for discipline should address actions taken for sexual misconduct via presbytery policies, on the job substance abuse, theft, abusive behavior. Now, how you define those things, there can be more specific, I wish I could have, but I couldn't put down subsets for this because I only have a limited amount of time. But those are the areas that you need to be looking for in what sort of, disciplinary. Can we have another workshop, Kim, someday? But those are things that I thought were important. The disciplinary process should be reviewed with non-ordained staff before they're hired, with the understanding that in the church, they're an at-will employee. So if you don't state that someone's an at-will employee, then you could open yourself up for a lot of grief. So they should understand what the process is. They should understand, what their redress is, what the church does. I mean, all that stuff should be in your disciplinary process of your procedure and policies manual. After the person is hired, this is super, super, super important. The policy should be signed and dated by the employee and 2 witnesses by the personnel committee, so that no one can come back and say, well, I didn't know, because it's clearly spelled out. But again, so now, because this is one of the problems, I've worked with personnel committees in 3 different presbyteries. One of the problems I've seen is personnel committees get discipline and performance evaluation mixed up. They get discipline and setting goals to help somebody in an area where they may be weak, or setting accountability goals that haven't been met. They get it mixed up with the disciplinary process. The disciplinary process is quite a bit more serious than, well, you know what, I just can't handle the fact that for the 5th time this year, the Apostles' Creed wasn't in the bulletin. Or didn't we decide to use the ecumenical creed 3 years ago? And why does the traditional one get put in here? I mean, those are different. The disciplinary process needs to be concise, stated, and identify what are the ethical boundaries that the PCOSA and Bethel Church are going to adhere to for all of its staff. So that was a little bit more than 5 minutes, but I think we made it.
Hey, this is good. We've tried to time ourselves, as you can tell. We've been trying to stay within a constraint because we know that you're going to have some questions. And one of the things I want to say, as I first of all thank all of our presenters for their wonderful preparation and materials. I want to say very clearly that there is absolutely time for more workshops. And so that's why I said to you earlier, I'll ask you, what do we need more on? And if you come back and say, well, here's an element of tonight's presentation I'd like to know more about, we're all for it. We've already had a suggestion from someone that we offer a workshop that role plays how to do annual reviews so that you can see people doing the give and take and leading that kind of process and what that might be like. So let's open for some questions. Just raise your hand, or either in the reaction section or actually raising, and I will call on you and we'll see who can answer your questions that you have. Hey, Karen Garrett, go for it.
Yes. My question is, I just wanted clarification. It sounded like the session actually appoints the personnel committee and the people that are on the personnel committee. Is that correct?
Andrew?
I can respond to that. So the session is ultimately responsible for whatever process you put in place. I would recommend it that way. But again, it depends on your congregation. I mean, some congregations, they have different committees that appoint a committee that appoints all of the committees. I've been in a large congregation like that, where they literally had kind of their own nominating committee. Most congregations I'm aware of in Baltimore Presbytery, it would be more the session thinking about those things. But then a lot of committees, for example, in my congregation are more like teams or much less formalized. And it's sort of like come one, come all. The personnel committee is a committee of the session. And so the session has ultimate authority to decide how that's done. I would recommend, and colleagues correct me if I'm wrong, but I would recommend that session appoint the members of that committee.
Yeah, I cannot just real quick. That's super important because, you know, there are churches, well, we need to have a deacon, we need to have a trustee. Well, we all know that committee dynamics and committee relationships can be complex within the church. And one of the ways you can quickly get somebody with an axe to grind on a personnel committee is for the trustees to say, well, this is our personnel committee representative. And if your process, you know, allows for that, then the session really loses control of making sure that that committee stays as above board and impartial as possible. So yeah, I think it's up to you. It is many things in the PCUSA, but yeah, I think the session should appoint the personnel committee.
And then I have one more question. My other question is, for churches that don't currently have a pastor, do you have any recommendations for us as far as ex officio?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I don't think you would necessarily need an ex officio as long as the committee itself is chaired by an active elder on session. I think that's the key thing. I think the ex officio is simply to recognize that a pastor or head of staff needs to be involved in personnel issues, but doesn't have a vote, does have a voice, but doesn't have a vote in setting those policies, obviously, because there's a little bit of a conflict of interest in that. So yeah, I don't think you need to replace that, need to add someone else to fulfill an ex officio position. It's more about recognizing that the pastor needs to have a role there, but it's not a role of a vote.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me take a moment to notice the chat. We have a question about sharing contact information. I am happy to do that of everybody who's registered, but I recognize that some of you may not want your contact information shared. So if you would not like that shared, would you please send me a quick chat message? You can send it just to me personally. Otherwise, I will email all of you everybody's contact information so you can be in touch with everybody. Opportunity to see staff handbooks from other churches. That's a great idea. I find that churches get stuck. How do we create something this big without a template, without some ideas? So I will put that down as an idea for another time that we could do. And of course, once you have contact information, you can share back and forth. So there's a couple things. Who else? And I'm answering a couple direct chats. Who else has a question that you would like to ask? Hey, John?
Yeah, I guess my question is, what role should, if you're on the personnel committee, what role should the congregation have to provide input? Because the job description has all of these things, and I'll just use say the pastor for an example. The job description for the pastor has all of these things that are goals, et cetera, for the pastor. I'm only one person, and if there's, 2 or 3 people on the committee, we may have input from 2 or 3 people, but for how do we know what the rest of the congregation thinks about those areas? So, and I understand the need for confidentiality and keeping out, people who have an axe to grind, but sometimes the axe to grind is legitimate, I guess, if, for not to be vindictive, but, somebody might have a different view of whether, the pastor's role in a specific responsibility is being done properly or well versus my opinion, which may be different than their opinion. So I guess my ultimate question is, what do you do to try to get input from other people besides the people on the committee, if that's appropriate or not?
There are a number of evaluation tools out there, a number. Evaluation tools that are best are not ones that do a blanket questionnaire, but that target specific demographic within the church. Also, if people do have a grievance and they have a concern, that having a grievance form that has dual accountability on it. In other words, if you really have an issue, are you willing to sign your name to it? If you're not willing to sign your name to it, we move on. So I have a sample of that. If you want one, I think that, this is what we could get into a little bit, but there are a number of evaluation tools that allow for congregational input. There really are. As far as somebody that has an issue, some sort of grievance process, where you go is the personnel committee, not the parking lot. That's the importance of having a strong personnel committee, is if you do have that issue, your personnel committee needs to be approachable. So, in a nutshell, I think that's as quickly as I can do it. So,
Yeah, I think I would add, John, a lot of what I've seen happen in the places where I've been and what I've led is I have evaluations that I've tailored to job descriptions. We have a first page that kind of talks about general approaches to work, work manner, work habits, work motivation, all those kinds of things. And then a second page, it's all about the job description. And I hand those out to people who have direct contact with each employee every year. And I ask them to fill those out and return them. For congregations, I've often seen the personnel committee, with regard to me, they will have an evaluation and they will grab about 5 or 6 other folks, including elders, and ask them to fill it out, and they'll rotate who that is on different years so that they're getting different input from people. And they have tried to not pick the people who think I can do no wrong and walk on water and not to pick the people who can't stand me, but to pick the folks in between. So that's how I've seen congregational input happen at different times, if that's helpful.
Thank you.
If I can just add too, for my evaluation, the sessions kind of got in the habit of a similar instrument as Kim just described. And then all active elders have an opportunity to respond if they wish. And then the personnel committee sorts through that. And then as head of staff, when I do evaluations for staff that I supervise, I've also done something very similar, which is there's certainly a written tool. And I often will have a staff member, I will ask them to suggest 2 people who they've worked most closely with for me to have a conversation with. And then I reserve the right to talk to others as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that has often worked really well because I think for the most part, staff do not choose the people who are just going to say great things about them, but actually the people they worked with the most. And so I think some of the qualitative responses that you get from people is as helpful or more helpful than some of the more quantitative, is this person 1, 2, or 3, 5 kind of thing. And then the last thing I'll say, just as an example of how helpful this can be, like my evaluation this past year, it was really helpful because as we sorted through it in the personnel committee, it was clear that there was some issues beyond my own performance, beyond my own evaluation around how the session was operating. And so that enabled the personnel committee to get at something deeper as a result of asking some of these questions that started out that really didn't belong in my evaluation, frankly, but was able to lead them to a deeper kind of conversation. So I agree with what everybody said. Evaluations are critical and probably the most important thing in sustaining staff morale over time, because people do want to grow, they do want to get better, and they want to be evaluated fairly and often, and also commended for good work.
Mm-hmm.
I also ask in all my evaluations, I ask staff members, what could we be doing better to support you? This is not a one-way street.
Right.
So I ask them to evaluate how we're doing. Terry, anything you want to add on that before I go back to a couple of the chat things and see what else we've got?
Only that we don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, in that there's a very practical, I remember when, I don't know if Todd or Andrew mentioned about the mistakes in the bulletin.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's the simplest thing is to not expect the secretary to proofread the bulletin. And
Mhm.
seriously, just be sure that you have somebody else proofreading the bulletin. And I think one of the things that staff evaluations also mean is finding the practical, the easy solutions, that this isn't a disciplinary thing. But I don't want to go into a congregation on a Sunday morning and have someone say, do you know there are 4 mistakes in the bulletin? I mean, that would definitely break the morning. But I do believe, just the simple, practical way of saying, hey, if this is something that's a problem, this is a challenge, let's fix it with a proofreader who's one of our English teachers or someone, that comes in and it's sometimes we make things so much more difficult than what they really are.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, another thing, I guess, in regards to your church and your staffs, and what I've asked, what I've talked to organizations about and asked people to realize that church and church staffs did a 180-degree turn when we went into COVID. We did.
Mm-hmm.
We are now doing a 180-degree turn again right now, because everybody wants everything to be the way it was. I don't know about other pastors on this panel, but all the old complaints I hadn't heard for 2 years, I've heard in a wave in the last 2 weeks. So, I guess one of the other things that's important about personnel committees is you can help your staff with these 180-degree turns with a good policy. Because, I kind of, at 55 years old, when someone comes complaining about that old stuff, I just kind of go, well, I guess, this is still important to this person, but it can also be a stress, and I think a good personnel committee can help alleviate the stress of when crisis hits and then when we emerge from crisis, which can be crisis in and of itself too. So.
All right, so Deborah had a question in the chat about some standard language for handbooks. I'm going to advise you to check with your insurance companies.
Mm-hmm.
They often have a mock-up of handbook kind of material with language that is suggested that you can adapt. Brotherhood Mutual has that, which Mount Hebron has been using we've been working on handbooks all year. And we have used a lot of that as a structure and a guide to helping us create a handbook that works. We're also going to have it reviewed by an attorney because we've got a whole bunch of nuances with a large nursery school and all kinds of things like that. You may not have to go through all of that, but insurance companies are very helpful, and often the information is on their website if you just get on there and dig, or call your insurance person and just ask. They're very happy to have people ask about that kind of stuff and very happy to help. So that's a great way to have some standard language that you can use and adapt. All right, more questions.
Yes, I have one.
Okay, Kenneth.
I've been trying to put it in the chat, but I don't type as fast. Should compliments be documented as well as the grievances as far as going on an employee's file? the reason I ask that question is because sometimes if you get a compliment from someone in your congregation about, say, the sexton, that compliment could be something that's not a part of his procedures or his job description. And that could be something that could be added at a later date because that quality that individual has could be something that's worthwhile for the church. So should compliments and things like that also be documented as well as grievances?
It's a great idea.
Definitely.
That's a great idea. Absolutely. And you know, when I talked about grievances, one of the ways to cut down grievances is to have a grievance form. Once you're asking someone to put their name to it, certain things don't become quite as important anymore. But yes, I think it's a really, really good idea. Really, really good idea. I think I'm going to add that somehow.
I didn't mean to add that. I didn't mean to hit.
No, I mean, I'm going to add it. I'm going to add
I
it
thought
to
about you to
Bethel.
chat.
I'm going to add it to Bethel. You know, that
Yep.
I'm going to figure out a way to incorporate that idea. It's a really good idea.
But
It's a
that's
good
going up,
thing.
that's the idea of going above and beyond. And that's
Yep.
what you want. That means you have a happy sexton and you
Yep.
have someone who's really, that's building the kingdom.
Mhm.
That's what
is.
we're all about. We want compliments
Mhm.
in the job descriptions. We in the annual review,
Absolutely.
because praise God, that's a good thing.
Yeah. And at
Yeah,
Bethel, we do include, those types of things. But I like your idea of, lifting up specific instances, specific contributions. That's a great idea.
absolutely. Some highlights could go a lot of different places to lift up staff efforts. And just as we lift up our volunteers in our churches, I spend a lot of time doing that in my annual reviews. And often I will, when I start an annual review, I won't send people the stuff ahead of time because they'll just read for the negative. So I make them listen to me while I give all the positives. Then I'll hand them the form and we'll go over the stuff that could be viewed as improvements. But people get panicky about that and then they don't hear the good stuff. So you're raising up a way, Kenneth, for us to really focus on the good. And we need that. I think what I've heard above all from the people I've talked to, which is mostly pastors, but not exclusively, is people are just feeling unappreciated.
Yep.
And it's so easy to help people feel appreciated if we work at it. Just a little bit of effort makes a big difference. And we did a workshop last month on staff retention. One of the things we talked about was about some of these things and helping people feel that way. If any of you are not honoring your pastor's ordination anniversaries, that is one of the easiest ways to help your pastors feel appreciated and loved. We remember those things. I can tell you the date, time, location, every bit of it. I remember it every year. I celebrate it. Pastors, that matters to a pastor. And so if you celebrate that with them or even surprise them with it, it goes a long way. And then staff anniversaries the same way. When did your staff members start working? So.
Yeah, I just want to say 150% true. I mean, I don't know any church worker who is motivated primarily by compensation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's important. That's really important. But people are really motivated to want to think about, you said earlier, Terry, building the kingdom. Am I doing God's work in and through the church? Am I connecting with God's people? So that kind of feedback is worth its weight in gold. And there's no reason to withhold it. The other thing I would just say is, and this probably is more for, heads of staff like me who are supervising, I don't like to surprise anybody at the annual review time with things that we haven't already discussed. That's probably harder for a personnel committee to pull off, because you may not discover some things if you're using a tool. And there are occasions where there's something new that rises up, but mostly for me, the annual review is a formalized process about things that are really already known and discussed. Because there's nothing worse than feeling like you've been appreciated for 11 months and then walking into an annual review and sort of getting blindsided with new things that you knew nothing about and weren't able to do anything about. So there is I think the relationship here is really important to think about.
Well, and just following up on what Terry talked about, the theological underpinnings. One of my favorite quotes by Desmond Tutu, it says, when we tend to think love is a feeling, but it's not. Love is an action. Love is something we do for others. And in having a good, solid process is love in action. It's love in action. And I really think, good personnel policies can go a lot towards stabilizing a church.
Okay, so let me call for last questions and also start to call for ideas about themes of workshops that you would like to see in the future. We are trying to continue to address things that are coming up. We've got a satisfied group here. No further questions. Everybody's got what they need. All right, so I will just remind you, please pay close attention to the Presbytery website. There are tons of resources there. And I'm just as guilty, as I said in my email, of thinking, now, wait a second, I need information on this. Why hasn't the Presbytery done this? And then I go to the website and go, oops, it's there and I just didn't see it. Or I didn't bother to go look. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, not just for personnel committees, but for lots of other things as well. So please do take a peek at that and familiarize yourself with what's available. Amy.
Yeah, I will say just an idea for the future. I'm a new elder this year. It's my first time being an elder with the church. And I work for a very formal corporation. So sometimes it's very hard for me to separate a little bit of the business mindedness with being at the church. And one way I've noticed that I tend to struggle slightly is with the writing. I'm used to writing very corporate, and I'm trying to figure out how to write more for the church, if that makes sense, not being so corporate minded. So I think I'm used to giving year-end feedback, year-end reviews, and all of that. I'm very comfortable in that space, but more adding in the language of being in, in a church versus a corporation would be very helpful for me to kind of shift that mindset when I'm working at work versus working as an elder.
Okay, that's a great suggestion. And I will say that the sample evaluations on the website too, especially for pastors, kind of start to go that way a little bit. They reform some of that language, which could be helpful for you to look at as well. Yeah. Okay, I've got that written down. Thank you, Amy. Anyone
Kimberly,
else? Yes, Kenneth.
Maybe in the future, what I probably need help with is the job interview. When you're interviewing a sexton, it was different from the business point of view. Maybe it would help if we cover that.
Okay. Yes. And some of us have been doing a lot of that lately. So yes, job interviews are important. And the kinds of questions we ask and listening for the kinds of questions our interviewees ask. Really, really important. So yes, I've got that down. That's a great idea for another time. Anyone else? Okay. Is there anyone who, I see some in the chat? Great, I'm noting those as well. So is there anyone who would like to close us in prayer tonight?
I'll do it.
All right. Thank you, Todd.
Holy God, we come to you in awe of your presence and your love and the way in which your spirit moves in and through and among all peoples. Lord, be with each and every person here in this place tonight. Lord, as your spirit moves in them, may they bring back to their churches that which you would have them hear so that they can go back and the staff knows that they're loved, that their staff can be uplifted in the way that they serve the congregation, and that congregations may feel like their staff is approachable. Lord, be with the people here tonight. Bless them. Move them into this evening, resting in the power of your love. We give you thanks for your presence, your power, and your spirit that guides us each and every day through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Again, thank you all, and keep looking at your tidings and on the Presbytery website for more workshops coming up in the future. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Yeah.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.